Welcome to the second part of Beyond the Soundbites, a conversation about racism and inequality in the UK. So really, it's the second part of what was for us, and for those who were able to join us last time, a really interesting conversation about a topic which has been in the headlines for the past month or so, but which is also very close to all of our hearts on the panel. And it's a topic that has been revisited over and over again for many a decade and many a century, actually. And here we are sat around virtually, hopefully trying to find some solutions. But before that, it's about having a conversation to explore the topic. And I'm fortunate enough to have with me quite a fantastic panel of people. So first off, we have my friend and colleague Tessa Dugmore, Tess is her background's in community development, and she actually grew up in South Africa when apartheid was still a thing. And that's hopefully something we're going to explore with Tess. We have G of Purple Frog Connections, who's a diversity trainer, writes some amazing articles on social media as well, and also an ex-police officer. Definitely check out his website on purplefrog-connections.com. We have Safia, who's the founder and CEO of Women's Inclusive Team in Tower Hamlets, and is also an entrepreneur and has done a million other amazing things. Definitely worth connecting with her and everybody else. We have Mohammed Artan, who is a publisher, a bookseller, and also a student of both Islamic and African history. We have Dave, who actually was a bit of a fan's favorite from last time. You'd be glad to know Dave, Reverend Dave Pilkington, who is obviously a Church of England curate and has a background in community development and has also done work in South Africa. And last but not least, my lovely dear friend, Zoe Portlock, who is a woman of many talents and has been doing community development work for a very long time. We've known each other for 20 odd years, has had some senior positions, does loads of stuff around diversity as well, particularly around disability and generally in the community development field. So that's the panel that we've got today. We've got an hour and a half-ish, and the idea is that we're just going to have a conversation, just like a group of friends would. And we have hopefully some people watching and watching afterwards. If you're watching live, if all is working, you should be able to kind of, join us by messaging in the chat. We'll have an opportunity for question and answer as well. And we're just going to try and keep things as natural as we can. So really, to get things started, I thought maybe I could come to you, Tess, and just ask you about kind of your experiences in South Africa, and just for us to think about what happens when racism really goes unchecked.
Okay, so apartheid was in its death throes when I was about, like a young teenager. And you described me earlier as, being an activist, and I was quite young. My family were very politically involved, so I guess that my experience was different to other white kids growing up because we were politically involved, and as a result, quite unpopular. If I can just put into context what it was like, the town I grew up in was a beautiful place. It's like a tourist magnet between the sea and the mountains. I went to a school that was a white school. It wasn't just a white school. I lived in a white area. I was only allowed to play sport with other white kids. And when I went to the beach, as we often did, I went to a beach which was just for white people. So although that sounds like a science fiction, it was really what was happening, and it wasn't that long ago. So things were very blunt in South Africa. It was black, white, right, wrong, freedom, or apartheid. And it was only since coming to the UK with a big chip on my shoulder, everyone would hear my accent and, immediately assume that I was one way. And it was quite an eye-opener for me, actually, seeing how racism, even although it wasn't in law as apartheid was, exists here and still exists. You know, America is also pretty blunt, but South Africa was a crazy place to grow up in. And before we were the Rainbow Nation, you know, we were classified as white, colored, Indian, and black. And the justification for doing this was that, you know, each racial group would blossom on its own. You know, what a load of BS, really. Apartheid as a legal system existed for about 46 years. And it's crazy to think like a minority rule where I think whites were probably about 6-7% of the population, you know, what was in charge. And I think that, you know, my mum was the one who really dragged us all along, and made us aware and made us call out racism when we saw it. I don't know if you want me to tell you any.
How was that as an experience, actually challenging racism in what was actually a racist system, right? It was racist law and racist system. How was that as an experience, challenging that?
It was scary. And I mean, as a teenager, you feel like you don't want to put your head above the parapet. You kind of want to fit in, etc. But it was so obviously disgusting and wrong that, you know, I didn't have a problem really being unpopular. I remember one time though, I just got my first job as a waitress, and I was talking to a couple of my black colleagues who they were not allowed to be waiters or waitresses, by the way. They only had to work in the kitchens. But these guys used to save my butt when I'd mess up orders, etc. And they were really dear colleagues. And I was chatting to them outside the restaurant with my friend, and we were next to the magistrate's court. And this guy leaned out and just yelled, "Talking to the blacks, hey?" And when I went home and told my mum, she was just like, "Right, we're going down there." And we went to the magistrate's office. We said, look, it was about the 4th floor, 3rd window from the top. We were told, no, the magistrate himself would see us. And we went in, my friend and I, with my mum, and it was the guy. He was the one who'd leant out of the window and shouted this. And my friend just leaned over to me and she said, "Tess, we rent our house from this guy." And it was just like such an uncomfortable, horrible position to be in. But I mean, that for me is like a really small example, because I always knew we have food, I have a house, I am privileged. I mean, what our family went through, even though we had death threats, my brother was chucked in jail and he was beaten up, our phone was tapped.
And your brother's a politician?
Yeah, he was actually one of a handful of whites who was elected in our first democratic election to stand for the ANC, and he's still well, he's the official oh God, what's it called? He's in the DA. I shouldn't be partisan, but the DA is you know, leading in the Western Cape, and he's in the ANC. So
sure, yeah,
he's still there. Yeah,
I mean,
the good fight.
Yeah, and I think what's interesting, and I was thinking about this again, reflecting on my ripe old age these days, is that a lot of kind of the younger generation now won't remember apartheid from the 90s, and just realize that we're not talking about something, because much of the narrative that we hear about the discussion is about something that happened 100 years ago, or George Floyd, and you know, that's just one-off incidents and so on. But we're talking about systems of institutionalized racism that were around just, you know, 20-30 years ago, which is really scary to think of, actually, and to think that it wasn't just, oh, South Africa's out there on its own doing this. There were countries that almost endorsed it and wouldn't stand against that. And how far we've come in 20-30 years, but also how far we haven't come, because what's happened is so much of that kind of overt racism is no longer considered acceptable in many places of the world. But we still have some of that still with us today, and it's almost harder to pinpoint. I mean, G, I'm going to come to you and I'm going to pick on Tess a little bit. So when I text Tess last time, when I said to her, you know, are you interested in being involved on this in the second conversation? So she said, yeah, I'm really interested, and yeah, I'll bring my guilty white self along. And I'm like, you know what, we addressed it last time, but I'll pick that up just for you. And she said, oh, gee, thanks. So I said, hey, what are friends of color for? So that this thing about kind of white guilt, it'll be really interesting to pick up, because what I want to explore with you is something you said last time really resonated with me. And you were saying, yeah, we need to talk about actions, and those sorts of things are important, of course. But what we need to understand is the process, the emotional process that people need to go through, people of all colors, as we have these discussions. And you were saying, you know, there's going to be anger. And that got me thinking, you know, we talk about the stages of grief and denial, and we've definitely seen a lot of denial. We've seen a lot of anger. Is that almost the theory that you're positing, that, you know, there are stages of grief, essentially, that people need to go through, and particularly the white community?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose stages of grief is one way of putting it. I would say stages of change. Yeah. And, you know, there's a path between the Black communities and the white communities. There is this space, what I call the emotional space, where it's filled with anger, blame, defensiveness, frustration, fear, and a lot of powerful emotions in there. And I think we focus too much on what we need to do without recognizing that there is this emotional space that needs to be addressed. And without that healing of that space, the conversation will always be polarized. We will never get to a place where we can actually start to talk.
Yeah, I imagine you've seen that process quite a lot through the work that you do as a diversity trainer. Yeah. Can you just give us a sense of what you think that process looks like?
Sorry, in what sense?
In the sense of, is it kind of a linear process that people go from like A to B to C, and then eventually they come around, or is it?
No, it's not a linear process. I mean, the emotions, the thing about the emotions of that space is that they're not in a categorized order, and people are at different stages, different levels. It's a mixture. It's a mixture of emotions in that space. It's about recognizing that that is an emotional space. Right? Yeah. So it's not necessarily about recognizing what the emotions are. First of all, let's recognize there is a space where these emotions exist, right? And then start to work from there, and recognizing that you're angry, I'm angry, we're both angry. So that's the starting place. We've got something in common. And linking it into Tess to a certain extent, there's a story. I don't know whether the story is true. There's a story about Nelson Mandela when he was imprisoned, and he was having secret visits with the then president of South Africa, de Klerk. And the story goes that the other ANC members in the prison said to him, why are you meeting with that man? He's a racist. And Mandela said, well, we both want the same thing. And they said, what's that? He goes, we both want a great South Africa. We just have different definitions of what that means. And, you know, when you look at whether it's racism or racism, we all want the same thing. We want a decent society. We just have different definitions of what decent means. And it's about recognizing that we want the same thing. We're just coming from different spaces, and we're coming with different emotions.
Yeah, fantastic. I mean, the whole issue of guilt, maybe Mohammed, I'll kind of come to you, because I know identity is something that you're interested in as a topic. For me, from I suppose it's easy from the outside looking in as a non-white person. And we talked about this last time when we had the session, and I'll bring it up again, is that really when I can understand why some people might feel guilty, except they don't really have any reason to feel guilty, because they haven't perpetrated any of these things. I mean, let's take, you know, Tess as an example, and her family. They probably did more around anti-racism than a lot of Black people might have done, you know. And so it's not necessarily about the color of your skin as much as it is about, you know, what's the phrase about the content of your character, right? And so where do you stand on this kind of topic of white guilt, shall we call it?
That's a difficult question, to be honest. But if I may reflect on that personally, I see in my society, for example, the Somali community, for example, who are predominantly, obviously, as you know, Black people. There are obviously what we call quote unquote minority groups within the Somali sort of landscape. And so we look at that and we see the history of that. And for example, how they have been treated and how they have lived within the similar borders that we preoccupy and the spaces that we live in. And the way that sort of the mainstream Somalis, as it were, have dealt with them, despite them being Black, despite them being of probably similar ethnicity, despite speaking the same language and everything else. And then we sort of, in terms of our history and reliving that past, which is an example of what we now today see with the Black Lives Movement and stuff, or what's going on in the US and everything else, and the statues and all these things being turned down. And we look at and then reflect on my own personal history and my own society, and I think about it, and then I have to sort of think about the sort of the damage and the narratives that the main group of Somalis have done to what we called quote unquote minority groups that lived within the borders of the Somali Peninsula. And so how I then magnify sort of incidents which would have been painful to them in terms of memory, but would have been a nationalistic to the mainstream Somalis, as it were. And so how do you live with that? So in one way, you have an image of something that you're, as a Somali, proud of, and something that you can share with the most of the Somalis that you know, right? But that have a sort of that causes a painful memory for other Somalis. Do you follow me? Mm-hmm. And so, and despite us being of the same color, despite us speaking the same language, having the same religious background, the same worldview, as it were, but we do not share similar history. We do not share lived experiences and that sort of thing. So you have to sort of adjust yourself in terms of when you are unpacking. And for someone who loves history and who loves who has a passion for that part of the identity that I have, right? I have to always be conscious on how I unpack these histories, on how I talk about it, and how I sort of magnify, you know?
Yeah, can I just explore that with you a little bit? So, you know, this kind of construct around race is a really interesting one. So we use it all the time, right? It's everywhere we look. We talk about kind of white people, Black people, etc., and so on. And then when we unpack history, as you say, we talk about, well, this is what white people did to Black people, and therefore I've already described, you know, maybe Tess, Zoe, and Dave as white people, and then I've said, well, this is what white people did, and the inference is that you are somehow guilty. And so the use of race as a construct and how we unpack language, how we use language in unpacking some of this history is a really interesting kind of concept. How do we get around that?
And so for me personally, if just to reflect and sort of take it back to the early days of the prophetic mission, for example, when we look at Islam as the model that we look up to, and I think about that, and I think about the environment that the Prophet lived in, which was mainly an Arab society. Obviously, they had their own minority groups. They had the Africans within their societies. They had their Blacks. They had their Europeans, which they called Rumis, right? And they had their Persians that lived within the society. So it was a multicultural hub, as it were. But the main problem that they faced in terms of racism was related to class, rather than skin color, right? So you had Black people who were, for example, of a higher class, and then you had a Black other type of people who were of a lower class. And so you had Blacks who were discriminating against another Black, not based on color, although sometimes that would be the derogatory terms that would be used, but it would be based on class system, right? And so And when a prophet unpacked this ill of the society, he would always say, this is an ugly thing. He would immediately put a stop to it, right? And sometimes even he would get up from a gathering when these type of conversations were going on, and he would walk away, and some of the attendees would be sort of put off by it, and then say, what happened? What did I do? Do you hate me? Do you dislike me? He would say, no, I don't hate you. I don't dislike you, but you have an ugliness, or you had a bit of jahiliyyah, which was the term, which is an ignorance. You have a bit of ignorance still in you, despite having a decades of progressive thought, ignorance in you. And so that ignorance, that racism that we have in terms of a worldview, is something that is part of our upbringing sometimes, and we end up struggling with it constantly. And so I see that beyond the color. I see it as some sort of what you mentioned earlier on, an infrastructure that is within the society, whether those who are in power maintain that system or not.
I'm gonna come back to that in a second, because I really want to explore that slightly differently and maybe go into a bit of depth. Sure. But just kind of staying on the issue about race and how we talk about this as in terms of language. I mean, there's let me come to you, Dave, and maybe just have a quick conversation from your perspective. Is it a thing? Is kind of white guilt a thing? Do you see people becoming quite defensive or sad or angry because they somehow feel themselves to be connected to what's happened in the past, or they feel that they're being accused of that?
I think just from my limited experience, there's a fear of accusation. I had a really interesting conversation because we've been doing online stuff in our church, and I preached about racism, and someone watched it, and we were out for a walk, and he basically said I was a Marxist and and he's a lovely guy. But what I realized afterwards, actually there's a lot of fear, and as in his eyes, as a white middle-aged middle-class man, he is the demon. He said, I'm not black, I'm straight, I'm not a gay woman or whatever. And he's taken so much of that on that actually there's a real, and I'm not saying it's justified, but there is a real sense of fear. And like G was saying, the emotions need to be addressed. And I think it's interesting that the group I run on a Thursday night, I wanted to look at racism, but I thought we won't look at that directly. We looked at difference. And it was lovely because we're a very mixed group of faith, colour and gender. But it was really interesting, just people speaking to their experience of difference. And I think it is trying to find the language that we can do it where people, one, can understand people's stories. Because I've spoken to people who say, well, the stats say blah, 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 and I'm like, but that's not the lived experience of many, many people. You can make stats say whatever you want. And I think people feel backed into a corner sometimes. So it's how you create that openness. So for me, being part of this is about learning. It's, I'm not coming here to fix you all and make sure you know what the real view of racism is. We need to have that openness to learn, to be challenged, to have our views challenged, but also, I guess, in some ways to be able to express our views, and hopefully not the abhorrent ones, but to express it and be corrected and learn. My views aren't right on everything, and I need other people to say, you might want to rethink that.
Yeah, and I think that's so go on, Tess, go on.
Sorry, I've been doing quite a bit of reading over the last couple of years, and even more recently there seems to be a feeling as well that amongst lay people and academics, that when white people are seen to engage in like race talk, it very soon comes back to their progressive credentials, their guilt, their experience. And that's why I was a little bit nervous talking about, me as a South African, because I was thinking, oh God, it's about me. But the thing is, it's quite affirming to hear people talk, because we've all had experiences, and if we don't talk, we can't move forward. But I do agree with the point that we can only start talking meaningfully if we acknowledge that we've had hundreds of years of affirmative action. And when we talk about like reparation, affirmative action, representation, all of these kind of quite, controversial, strong, hard-hitting policies which might make a change, that fear comes through again from whites who think like, well, I don't want anything to change for me. But I think that we have to acknowledge that we have been in a very fortunate position, and okay, you're not responsible for history, but you are responsible for acknowledging and going forward, I think.
So I think just to pick up on that, maybe a question to Zoe is, there's so many things to unpack here, right? So I think at the end of, at some point in the discussion last time round, we got to the point where we were saying, well, actually, there is no logical reason. Let's not talk about kind of emotions, but there's no logical reason for someone, anybody of any kind of color, to feel guilty about something that happened hundreds of years ago, of which they had no control over, right? And then there's no logic to blaming a certain group of people for that just because of the color of their skin. And yet we all need to acknowledge that those incidents in the past are what have led us to where we are now, and have led to some having privilege over others. And actually, as a person of color in Britain, I'm benefiting from some of that privilege over people in developing countries, for example, and there's kind of degrees to that. That's a really difficult thing to kind of have to unpick. And I don't know if you've had any thoughts about maybe some of the language or the direction that some of these conversations need to go in.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in our last discussion, I have to say the one thing that I did come away from was, and I think we do have to bring the emotion into it. I don't think we can actually put it to one side, because we're human beings. And if something feels directed at us, or if we feel trapped in corners, our human behaviour is to defend. I think we're coming out of that defensive stance. And I came away and I was really struck by just one simple statement that G said last time, which is, let the healing begin. Because I think if we get caught on this chapter of the white guilt and how fragile white identity is, and we are privileged and we can get into cars and have tinted windows, and I can be a sports person and get stopped with my baby in the back, but I think we're getting past that as a narrative, and now we need to reshape it. Language is really important, but also where the power exists in our modern world. And as much as we like to think we've moved to a more worldwide internet of web and interaction and using social media, we still have to remember the media and politics exist globally. And if you look at how that exists within the UK and who is framing the narrative around inequality, around anti-racist movements, we have to really take that with a pinch of salt and decide what matters to us, and really start to become the listener, the storyteller, the person who amplifies the lived experience of every day, so that we start to really push forward in our own ways, whether that be at a professional level. If you can look at strategic change or policy change, that's great. But actually starting with your everyday, those circles of friends around you, of family, the people that you experience in the shop down the local pub, the casual racism, particularly in somewhere like the UK, culturally, we're not like America in the sense that, it's so direct, and the challenges are different. I'm also really struck that we don't talk enough about class and race together. Again, that's a narrative where there's a commonality around lived experience, where it's about the majority. The Runnymede Trust are fantastic at bringing this work to our attention, and the more knowledge that we gain, the much more confidence that we have in being the true ally that we want to be moving forward. So that would be my take at the moment, some of my reflection, particularly having had the discussion previously.
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting, isn't it, that we talk how important the approach is to this, and how we can begin to make this conversation feel more inclusive and feel safer. Because even for me, sometimes, trying to have some of these conversations feels awkward. You're almost, tiptoeing around certain things. You're not sure what you should say and what you shouldn't say, and what you might be accused of, what you might not be accused of. And so it's about how we try and find a space that feels comfortable for everyone to have conversations like these. But the point that you picked up on, and I'll come to Safia, is that point around kind of class and race. And so much of the work that you do is kind of around working in disadvantaged communities, right? So people who are at the bottom end of that spectrum, that are disadvantaged by the color of their skin, a lot of the people that you work with, but also because of class, irrespective of color of skin. How do you think that the two kind of interplay, and how does that manifest itself in real life, and the sorts of things that you experience and you work with?
I think class and racism exists within communities. So you'd have that within the Somali community, like our colleagues have said, and then obviously in Tower Hamlets, within Tower Hamlets, you have that. I think as a charity organisation, obviously we deal with people that are at the bottom of the food chain, people that are, you know, on the low end of jobs, and that have suffered greatly with the crisis that we've currently had. But also on the other hand, we've had, you know, women and men who are on the side of maybe working in Canary Wharf and having amazing jobs, and the better class in terms of economically, that have supported us. And it's been amazing seeing those two come together during the crisis. And for me, what that demonstrated for me is that we are strong together. And that was really powerful to see that, especially, for example, in the community kitchen, where you had people that were able to make the samosas and people that were able to kind of coordinate the routes and plan the details and get the data and stuff like that. And that just brought community unity. But I think definitely in Tower Hamlets we have that. And when it comes up to race, within, like I said, the Somalis, but also you keep on hearing the word BAME. Within the BAME community, you have you know, class and racism and inequalities. And I think that discussion, what a lot of colleagues have said so far, that we have to get to a point where we're uncomfortable having, and you have to have those uncomfortable discussions where you actually pull out people, and you know, and people that know me know that my words and my intentions is purely going back to what G said. It comes from the notion of the idea that I want things to be better for all, not just one group, but for everybody. And I've had discussions with brothers and sisters in the Bangladeshi community saying, well, actually, let's sit down and look. Do you think that you, perhaps in terms of the wider community, is there inequalities between you know, within the Somalis and the Bangladeshi? And the answer is yes. You know, obviously when you start, and it is uncomfortable, because I guess it's that label that one can put on you, saying, oh, hey, Safia's got issues with, you know, with certain things. But it really isn't. It's about naming it, holding a discussion, and allowing people to actually see it as being, you know, unjust and unfair. And only when you say, hey, something doesn't add up here, you're then able to have those discussions. And I think you will always have class, and you will always have class and racism, but I think as soon as we start having those discussions as a community and then working together, so if you're in a position of, I guess, privilege, that you're able to then hold back the people and support the people, so it doesn't become, you know, such a huge gap, that we can try and close some of those gaps that exist. But I definitely grew up in, I guess, in this notional idea of being in primary school in Tower Hamlets. You felt the racism and inequalities, definitely. And now, like Zoe said, it's covered up and not as blatant as America, but we do have problems. And unless we say we have a problem, instead of saying, oh, we're okay, and that really annoys me. We say, well, I'm not as bad. Well, no, we have problems, and we need to challenge those problems and make sure that we have those frank, you know, uncomfortable discussions as well.
Yeah, I think that's again, so much to unpick just in terms of what you said. G, if I come back to you and your kind of experience around kind of facilitating these discussions, how do we start having some how do you make people feel comfortable enough to have uncomfortable conversations, is my question to you.
Yeah, I mean, it is a process. And I think the first thing is to understand what I bring to the table. And that's the first place to start, because, you know, a lot of the time we're talking about the other, what the other needs, or what's been done to the other. And first of all, actually, what have I learned about the other? Where have I got my experience from? Where have I got my story from? And if I recognize how my story has shaped me, I can then start to see how other people's stories have shaped them. And stories are a very powerful thing. I think one of the most powerful lessons I learned was when I was training to become a diversity facilitator. I was sent on a 6-week residential course in Yorkshire. And I turned up at this centre on the Sunday night. On the Monday morning, I went to the classroom. And there were 16 of us in the classroom, all whites, and I'm the only black guy. And the first thought that came into my head was, oh God, I've got to spend the next 6 weeks being the example. I've got to spend the next 6 weeks talking about my experience, how many times I've been stopped and searched, all these kind of things, you know, the stereotypes. And then the trainer walks in, who is a white guy with like cigarette ash on his shirt and egg stains down his jacket. And he was a bit of a Cockney geezer. And I thought, again, it reinforced the story I was telling myself. That 6 weeks, that guy, Malcolm, blew my mind. He knew more about my experience of the world and why I behaved in certain ways than I had ever considered. And I learned more about being black from him than I had in the entire time before I had even been on that course. And I remember sitting down with him and I said, how do you know this stuff? Because, you know, you're white, you're not supposed to know this stuff. And he said to me, he was a cop in Brixton during the Brixton riots. And one of the things that impacted him was the anger in the black community. And after the riots died down, he wanted to find out what that anger was about. So he started going to the barber shops and the community centers and playing dominoes and everything. And he sat down and he said, and what I did is I listened. I didn't go into offering an opinion. I just sat there and listened. And the more I listened, the more I wanted to know. And the more I wanted to know, he ended up going off to university and studying this and doing all these sort of things. And he said, and I just came out. And the phrase I use now is that, do you care enough to make yourself aware enough? And all of us can start from that point. Right? Let's start from the point of, what do I bring to the table? What am I learning about other people? And then we can start to move into, how does that impact on the people next to me? And it's about starting with my story.
And does that always have to be in this kind of structured way? Like, okay, people, we're going to sit around and we're going to talk about racism, we're going to talk about our stories, you know, and how much of this is to do with just natural interaction between peoples?
And that's the beauty of it. You create an organic environment. It's not, I mean, yes, there is a structure in the head, right? And there's a structure into facilitating. Of the way I look at it, my job is to go into that room and take all the emotions that are confusing and create a symphony of understanding. And it's almost like you become a conductor of those emotions. Okay, there's a bit of anger in the room. What do I need to temper that? And you're looking for these things all the time within that group. Yeah? And that's the process. Yeah? That's the phone.
Yeah, I know. I'm going to put myself on mute while you keep.
Yeah. But that's the process, me. It's about recognizing how you tap into and how you work with all of that stuff. So it's a very organic and very fluid process.
The phone's probably still going, and I don't know if you can hear me, Tess, but I was going to come to you and just ask you about that kind of process in your experience in South Africa and actually here. How much of the racism was perpetuated by the fact that people were kept separate, essentially, and how was that eventually dealt with? How did people intermingle, and how much of a problem do you think that is here? The fact that actually we don't, as much as we talk about London being multicultural, even certain areas being multicultural, that we don't have the opportunity, or we don't create the opportunities to kind of come together and learn about each other.
Well, I mean, the whole social housing scene for me as a South African who grew up with group areas was mind-blowing. And I loved seeing how mixed communities were in London. That was really different. And I think that for me, that's why social housing is so important, because it gives people a security of tenancy where they can have the time to get to know each other. And I've found, like in my experience of community development work, you'd be having a meeting about a certain project or development or whatever, and you get people from different estates who are really hostile towards each other. But then as they work together over months and months, definitely relationships improve. And once people get to know each other, what they have as their common interests, as G was saying, we all just want a decent life, we want to live in peace, be respected, our kids grow up safely, etc. That is a lot of things that we have in common. And I think that, in South Africa, the crazy thing was that all the peaceful protests which characterized the civil disobedience, it was peaceful. It was met by violence and bullying, shooting, intimidation, and it was all peaceful until just before Mandela went into jail. He created the Spear of the Nation, which was slightly more militant. And as uncomfortable as it is to acknowledge this, I do think that kind of action did speed things along. And when you were asking me before about things being left unchecked, how long can peaceful protests continue? People crack eventually, and if it's left unchecked, you get bad things happening, not just a slightly uncomfortable feeling, but violence and aggression. And to come back from that then, where and I know this is a bit flippant, but things like sanctions really made a difference in South Africa. The sports sanctions almost killed a nation of sport lovers. And I'll never, ever forget the feeling of the World Cup in '95. It was glorious. I've never felt so proud and cohesive and uplifted and as one. And we were all behind these, the one team. So I think that things that people share in common can really make them, stick together and work together. But I think in South Africa as well, that having, gone through that then unrest period, like in the, especially, 70s to late 80s, was then when we had our first democratic election, which, by the way, took 4 years of negotiation, where, it was all about, let's get our emotions out, as, G and people are saying, let's talk about what we want, what we have in common. Took 4 years to have that transition period. And then after that, we were hit with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I mean, how sophisticated, civilized, and emotionally respectful can you get? I mean, I can't believe it, because I don't think I would have been so patient if I had grown up as a Black person living in a township. I don't know if I could have done it. And I just think it's amazing. So, yeah.
Thanks. I think what you mentioned there about ultimately what binds us is our humanity, right? And we have way more in common than we have different. And Mohammed, I'll come to you, because this issue of identity is really interesting to me, because it's so different for different people. So I was saying this to G the other day, that, there's this issue of pride in one's race and the kind of color of your skin is really interesting to me. So, we see now that there's a lot of kind of Black pride, right? I am Black, I am proud. We hear Black is beautiful, all those sorts of things, right? And there's a real pride in that. And then there's almost a connection between people who are Black, irrespective of where they are in the world, because of that. And yet you don't have the same thing for brown people. Like, it's really, like, I don't think I've ever heard anyone say, I'm brown and I'm proud. Like, there's probably people watching this who are brown and just kind of laughing and saying, yeah, it's just not a thing that we do. And then now, God forbid any white person says, I'm white and I'm proud. Like, it's just, sorry, you can't do that. And yet, so this kind of thing about wanting to identify, and what we choose to identify with is interesting. And I was saying to G that for me personally, my identity is so conflicted. So my parents were born in Bangladesh. I was born here. My son, we were having dinner the other day, and my wife was speaking to my youngest daughter. She's only 5, and was doing the alphabet with her, and said something like, "Oh no, that country begins with B." And then my daughter said something, I can't remember, made a joke, and my wife was like, "No, it's Bangladesh. That's where your grandparents were born, and they are Bangladeshi." So my son says, he's 10, he says, "Oh, so is it to do with where we're born, our identity? So does that mean I'm English?" And I was like, no, I don't think it does. I don't think you can call yourself kind of English. British, maybe, but even then, like, am I really British? I don't know. And I had this experience when I went to Morocco, and you fill in the landing card, right? Ask you about nationality. And so I said British. So I get there, and the immigration officers, just like customs officers, like, "Oh, well, where are you from?" So I said, "Britain." So he said, "No, where are you from?" So I thought, maybe he just doesn't understand English, this guy, typical kind of English tourist. Why doesn't he speak English properly? And so, I was like, "London." He's like, "No, where are you from?" And I'm like,
I'm from.
Where do you live?" So I said, "London." Where do your parents live?" "London." "Where were your parents born?" "Bangladesh." He said, he took the landing card, crossed off British, and wrote Bangladeshi, right? And yet culturally, I really struggle to identify with. I've been to Bangladesh once in 1987. That's it. Like, that's the extent of knowledge that I have, much to my parents' disappointment. Talk to me a bit about this thing around identity and the constructs that we have. And just to finish that point off, I said to G, "Look, I like to think that I'm British. I'm not sure everyone else would see me as British. I don't think I could call myself English, because that almost feels like a race thing, and you almost have to be white to be English. I don't know if that's true or not. I'm not black. I don't see myself as brown. So the thing that I tend to identify with most is actually like my religion, like I'm a Muslim, because it's the one thing that I've chosen, and the one thing people go, "Oh yeah, you are one of those. Well, you can fit in that pigeonhole." So talk to me a bit about kind of identity and this race construct, because essentially it is a construct, and to me it's a strange thing for us to bond over, the fact that just the color of our skin, without any shared experiences or choices.
I've just be controversial and raise the issue where you mentioned, I've never heard anyone say sort of white pride or something, and I don't imagine that would be possible, because to be white in sort of a Western society is to be the norm, right? And so when you're the norm, you can't be proud of something that is normal, right? And so I remember back when I left home and I came here, I mean, specifically when I landed in Holland. So I left Somalia at the age of 10 or 11 years old or something. And all I knew about white or whiteness was what I saw on television. So I lived in Mogadishu. I lived well of life. I lived in a sort of a good lifestyle. So my identity was never ever an African or a black person. So I never saw myself an African or a black person until I landed on the shores of European landscape, as it were. And so that's when it hit me. Oh, I'm black, right? This is something that what's his name? The South African comedian Trevor Noah talks about a lot. You see? Yeah, and that's the reality. Whenever he mentions those sort of jokes around this stuff, that's something that I've lived through, and that's what I understand. So when I came and I landed in Schiphol, which is the airport, the international airport of Amsterdam, in round about what was 24th, 25th of December 1991, I've never seen snow in my life. I've never seen white people in my life. I just seen them on TV, when you watch them Hollywood and stuff. And as soon as I landed, I remember the image I had was, my parents and everybody was like, "Oh, we're going to go to Europe. We're going to go to a white people's country. We're going to go to a white environment." And I landed, and the airplane, the airplane didn't have that bridge where you go through the thing, and you had to get into a bus or something to take you to the terminal. And it was completely white landscape. It was like heavily snowed. And I was like, I knew the white people lived here, but I didn't know the land was white as well. So I didn't know the geography was white, And that is the sort of color image that you get, as it were. And so when I settled, and I was like 11 or 12-year-old child, a somewhat teenager, And at that time, that's when I'm developing a sort of an identity of who I am. Prior to that, I was just an average Joe. So I did not have no color, I did not have an ethnicity, I was just part of everybody else. And so when I lived in that lifestyle, and I lived in the sort of what was the refugee camps and everything else, and we were separated from the society, and we learned the language, and we developed, and we went to school to learn the Dutch language and everything else, and everybody looked at us differently, and everybody identified us differently. That's when I became someone who is aware of his skin color and an identity. So that's what I meant by if you're the norm, you won't see yourself as something. There is nothing to be proud for in that regard, right? You're just like everybody else. But when you're sort of somewhat the exception, and what we know as nowadays, which is an unfortunate terminology nowadays, the BME community, sort of Black and Asian minority ethnic groups, right? It's an unfortunate label now, because it sort of puts everybody together, right? So you have the white people, then you have the other, and all of the other fall under those rubric, BMAE or something like that, right? And so so the problem that you have with that is, in one way or the other, you sort of identified as the other, but you're also not so much identified as such, because you fall into a sort of a framework where you exist with many other people who are the other. And so you have to sort of exclude yourself as well from the minority groups, and you have to sort of identify yourself. Okay, what am I now? Am I brown, like you said earlier? Am I Black? Am I African? Am I disadvantaged? Am I woman? Am I Muslim? What am I? So you start unpacking all these different identities. When I remember a day I went to one of the universities, in Kingston University in London, and I was doing a lecture about what we call Somalinimo, which is a Somaliness, a concept known as Somaliness. And so majority of these people, attendees, were Somalis in terms of their background here. So I asked them, what does it mean to be Somali? Simple question, right? It's like you would ask, what does it mean to be British? What is the British values that we talk about, right? And so I asked them, what does it mean to be Somali? No two agreed on anything. No two agreed on. So it's not only when you deal with this, and this question of identity is becoming more and more fragmented. It's becoming more and more different variants of it. So it's very hard to understand this, but it's what you choose to identify yourself with, rather than what society, what sort of, which you said earlier, or pigeonhole that society puts you in, right? And so I identify like you, a Muslim, but I also identify myself as a Black person who is passionate about the rich history and culture that that produced me and that I come from. So yeah, it is a difficult struggle, is a difficult road. But it's an individual sort of discovery that everybody has to sort of go on. But yeah, fantastic. I don't know whether
Thank you. No, it makes a lot of sense, actually. And I think that's the challenge with so much of this, is that here we are trying to self-identify, to self-determine who we are, not to create kind of antagonism or differences between us and other in that way, but just to say, well, this is who I am, this is what I believe, this is what I stand for. And there are some of those things that will hold me in common with other people who believe those things. And fundamentally, going back to what I think was Tess was saying earlier, is that we just want decency. We're just decent people, right? And so that should be the thing that pulls us all together. And yet there are forces that almost intentionally or otherwise are trying to create divides, right, and are trying to make us pick and choose. And Zoe, I was going to come to you with this, and just it's something that Mohammed just said about white versus BAME. And even when we work with statistics, you know, I was just thinking about the census, you know, and we all have to legally fill this census in, and it asks you about your kind of ethnicity and all these sorts of things. And the groupings that you often see around these sorts of demographics are really interesting. So you see kind of white, so white British, white Irish, white, etc. I don't know if there's like a white European, but it doesn't matter whether you're from here, provided that you're white, you can join the white group, right? Then you have everybody else, BAME, but it's okay, we'll kind of break that down for you. So then there's black, and then you've got kind of black African, black Caribbean, you've got black, and so on. And then as long as you're black, you're in that group. And then when it comes to me, there's no brown. It's just Asian. So whether I'm kind of Chinese or from Bangladesh or wherever, like all you guys are together, right? And even though the cultural experiences are so different, hell, the skin color is so different, like it is between some of the racial groups, there's all these kind of artificial constructs around this. And even from like the government, and how problematic do you think that is, or do you think it's a necessary evil?
It's a big question.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Thank you. No, we've gone from census and descriptions, but no, they're important questions, aren't they? Because the more that we're constructed around these particular labels, the more that people buy into it rather than thinking outside of what that means, and the cultural experience that we all have through our own lived experience, regardless of colour and regardless of class. So there's so much within that construction around label, and I'm quite taken actually listening in. My background is supporting disabled people and disabled children for about 25 years now, and a lot of these conversations around identity, particularly in relation to disability, that agenda has been playing on, I would argue, in a much more amplified way than we have been talking about ethnicity and other things that feel much more sensitive until now, where actually we're trying to a certain extent, explode it so that we can start to really get under these issues. But if we start to think about the social and the medical model of disability, what it means to be called the other, how we use language, there's that saying that if you're not at the table, you're probably on the menu. So what does it mean to participate in the discussion? And I take this from the lived experience of walking alongside our disabled community or people with disabilities within our community of East London, where ethnicity, culture, religion is part of that, as well as gender and sexuality. It's not any one thing. But I think in my mind, it feels the clearest because it's something that I've been openly being advocate for and an ally about for so many years. And so how do we change our everyday language? And we do keep coming back down to this point because I think it's so important in how we construct the new narrative. I'm also taken around the ideas of solidarity, and also we have to understand the difference under label. And I can remember many years ago finding out the hard way about our deaf community and the deaf politics that exists, to the point where our deaf community will not relate to a label of disability. So if you see yourself as a non-disabled person and you look in on that, you're quite confused by that whole conversation. It takes many years, again, to listen well, to understand, and to then share. And I think that is part of the role of being an ally. Have I managed to get away from that census question quite easily?
Yeah, I was going to come back to it, but I'll pick on Safia instead. And before I do, I'll just ask everyone, everyone who's watching, if you've got any kind of comments or questions, just start posting them. We're going to try and get to them because we've got half an hour left. Safia, this kind of what comes up over and over again in these discussions, and has even within this discussion, is the need for us, one, to obviously have conversations and to have uncomfortable conversations and to create safe spaces for those. And a point that G made earlier is that those conversations actually need to be quite sensitively facilitated wherever possible. And then there is that kind of individual approach that we need to take at the local level as much as we can. In your experience and just in your opinion, how far will that get us? And is there another layer of work that needs to be done to address essentially the kind of institutional racism that we see and face? Are there other drivers there, or do you think this approach alone would work?
Wow.
Yeah, another easy one for you.
It's massive. But just on the censors one, by the way, I'm a real advocate for the censor. And I think that the censor is the tool in which stakeholders or those in positions of power understand the needs of the community, understand who the community is. And we've often lobbied under, even just like you said, the umbrella of one category needs to be broken down even more. And we've lobbied for the Somali title for many years, and this is going to be the first time that we're going to be on the list of choice. And I think it's really important to follow that, as a community, to complete it, because when it comes up to, i.e., who are the communities and how do we support the community, that gives, I guess, us the ammunition or the tools to be able to ask for change. And I think that's really important. And I think often what happens is, actually, if you're not, just like you, like Zoe said, we're on the menu. I think a lot of community members, they end up being so upset with positions of those in power and seeing them as not coming out of their rights or their haq, and not given, not hearing their voice. But you have to be able to be at the table where decisions are being made. You have to invest your time. You have to be able to articulate. Obviously, you're angry, you're upset, but you need to be strategic in terms of how you do that. And actually, that onus is not on just the Black community, it's upon everybody to make sure that when you're looking at something or there's an issue or a problem, that you don't forget the community at large. And I think that's really important. But the census kind of gives it a value to say, well, actually, this is the community in your borough. Have we got that around the table? Because sometimes, there's a Somali saying that even if you don't speak, even your own mother will not feed you. If you don't say to your mum, I haven't eaten or I haven't had something, then, even those who are the closest to you will forget you. And I think it doesn't come from somewhere bad. Most of the time, although there are incidents, of course, where there's bad intent in that, and maybe the easy way out. And I think sometimes we have to go through hardship, and after hardship comes ease, and that's an Islamic moral that I've really had, in terms of after every hardship comes ease. And I think we're at a point now where we're going through hardship, and hopefully, as long as we articulate ourselves and we have those meaningful, respectful discussions, that we unpick and look at everything, is really important. And your question was something about positions of power and
yeah, I think I'm just trying to get to the dynamics that are involved. So and this slightly touches on something that Mohammed was alluding to earlier, so I might kind of go back to him and then maybe come to Tess as well, is that we have these kind of experiences of racism and incidences of racism at an individual level, and we know that exists, but also sometimes the kind of structures of power, is I think how Mohammed might have put it, are also essentially racist. And so does us just having conversations among ourselves and kind of trying to address it at that level also ensure that those kind of structural changes happen, or do you think that we need to be doing something different to kind of make those changes happen?
I think the first thing that I've always said, and I'll continue to say, is that we live in a parallel world, where you literally within, for example, the borough in which we live in, you have, this community, which is maybe the white upper class, and then you have, within the same borough, you'd have the BAME, and then within the BAME, you have different, and everyone's living in the same borough, but not really living together and mixing and crossing paths. And I think that's really important to happen. I think recently you've had some changes in terms of people actually having those discussions, and actually the champions for the change must be, like I said, reflective of all communities, because it can't, just like domestic violence, when you say, it has to be men as well, champion and speaking up for the rights of women. And it's the same concept. You must have whites, blacks, Asians, and everyone sort of having that discussion. And I think positions of power, as well as those communities, we need to start having those discussions, and representation is the first step to having that change. And actually recently I had a frank discussion with what I call a friend now since COVID, and very closely lives in the same area as me. And she said, I never had any Black or ethnic minority friends. This is the first time. And she's embraced the support, and actually that's breaking the parallel barriers, the parallel world that we live in. And unless we do that as a community, as a nation, change will not take place. Unless it's almost like being selfish and saying I'm okay, I don't have a problem. And even, within the BAME community, you're like, because you've created that safety network and you don't have to, mix with other people, that you've created your own little community, that you haven't come across that. So I think it's definitely those challenges internally within like one borough, like I said, but also in positions of power, they need to also have people that reflect the community as well. They can't sit there, like in most of the boards when we're going there, if we're being honest, it's white men. And then you have, obviously, they're trying to make it equal and fair, and then you have women that have been put in the mix, and then obviously we're going to try and get the black community and so on. I think if you really want change, you have to make sure that your frontline staff, those in positions of making power, reflect the community, because if anything, you're a human being, and if, like I said to you, unless you have someone reminding you, it might not come from it. And I always say to people, it doesn't, most of the time, it doesn't come from somewhere bad. It's what we've seen as being a norm, and trying to break that norm, and actually just saying, well, this isn't normal. Let's just create a better society that reflects all, that hears the needs of all, that caters to the needs of all.
Yeah, fantastic. I think I'll come to Mohammed, and then I'll come to you, Tess. Mohammed, just to touch on what you were saying earlier, and I kind of stopped you mid-sentence, and I apologize, and I promised to come back to it, so I will. Actually, before I go there, there's just a couple of comments. So one comment from Sarah, who was on the panel here last time, said, where is it? There is no category for Latin American either. So it's all right. Latin America is quite small, isn't it, in terms of geography? So just it's a massive part of the world that the census just kind of totally ignores. But to come back to you, Mohammed, on this topic that you were saying, I mean, you touched on it about these kind of structures of power, and where kind of racism comes from. And I don't know if you want to say a little bit more on that, and then I'll kind of come to Tess, and we can have a conversation about that as well.
Yeah, we here in Leicester, we've been living a further lockdown for the last or an extra lockdown for 2 weeks, and for the life of me, no one knows why. No one has any clue, from the top down. So like from the mayor to like the average Joe on the street, we have no idea in terms of the healthcare and everything. No one can see a search of us on admittance. The data and everything that we have tells us we're just like everybody else in the nation, right? Yet, due to a test that has been a localized test that has been taken, that was predominantly in an area where sort of a Bay community lives, right? And that have seen quite a lot of sort of a positive results without identifying, without understanding that, right? And as a consequence, the fear mongering has started, whereby now the society that lives with one another, because we live in, as Safia was saying earlier, we live in those sort of parallel communities as well. Because so you got your Bengalis, you've got your Pakistanis, you've got your, so we're not only in terms of divided in terms of white versus sort of black and what is called black and Asian minority groups, right? But we actually have subdivisions within that, right? So you have your blacks, you have your West Indies, you have your Somalis, you have your new European, sort of East European communities. So we're subdivided, right? And so because that had happened, and certain localities have seen quite a, and these are the only places where they've taken the test. Everybody is now looking at one another, their neighbor, the person that they know, probably someone that they work with, probably someone who they're a close friend with, as some sort of aliens who are happy to get COVID-19 and spread COVID-19 around, okay? And so that whole, so it's like having the same street where house number 28 is on a lockdown and house number 30 is not, for example. Right, and so that type of systematic discrimination, and especially people that live in Leicester, have some sort of antenna up in terms of thinking, okay, we are being victimized, we have been specifically looked at because we are the largest minority ethnic groups in the UK, but also in Europe as well. So, and that's going to soon reach a level where the minority groups can be more. So the system is such now that a lot of people are scared. A lot of people cannot go on the streets, cannot do shopping. The police is everywhere. Police stopping, fining, sort of threatening. Local beat cops that were very close to you have strict guidelines, right? The local government has a strict guidelines. And so a lot of people are sort of put off by that. Why? Just because the government, when they woke up and say, yeah, Leicester needs extra lockdown because the numbers are quite problematic. And so these type of things speak to the core of in terms of power, and what it means to sort of exercise that power, especially in times like this where no one can actually speak against you, no one can challenge your data, no one can challenge. You just come out and you just say these things, and that's it. That's an advisory.
So let me come to Tess to explore that and just kind of touch on what you were saying earlier about some of the things that actually worked and made a difference to affect change. And so before you get into that, just, I think you mentioned this already, but just remind us. So there was this kind of almost a 4-year process of pain, right? Before people could move on from that emotionally and start having some real meaningful adult conversations about the issues. And so just talk to me a little bit about that process. And then from there, maybe just give us a quick summary of the sorts of things that you think worked to make a change at a more institutional level.
So I mentioned that in the 4 years since, when Mandela was released in 1990 and our first democratic election, which was the first time that everyone in the country could actually vote. It was, just completely groundbreaking. It was 4 years of chats and negotiations, and it wasn't like, and although Mandela and the ANC really were holding all the cards, it's not like they decided not to talk to those on the right or those, even further left. Everybody was involved in this executive, transition executive. And so, I mean, the luxury of time, I mean, people were so patient, and I think everyone was just on board to take that time to really discuss, unpack, decide what the new constitution was going to look like. It was, protecting minority rights, and now minority rights really were turned on their head. And, like Afrikaners who'd been really the ones in power and who'd been the architects of apartheid. So that happened for 4 years. And then we had the first democratic election where people could truly vote for whom they wanted to represent them. I mean, back in apartheid days, even before the 1983 referendum, where the question was, and it was a complete Sophie's choice, do we give the vote to Coloureds and Indians, or do we not give the vote to anyone? No, the question wasn't, what about Black people? So, of course, voting no in that referendum was really a hectic thing to do because, you knew that it wasn't fair. So that's why in 94, it was such a landmark, and why I feel so strongly that representation, going on to your next point about, what works, what makes change, is people need to organize, they need to be politically active. And I know you were talking a lot about identity, and I've learned something about, how it seems that the group here really wants things broken down so that many identities are reflected. But I wonder whether, as in the case of South Africa, the concept of political Blackness, where people brown of all shades, just kind of get together and go, no, we are stronger together in this instance, and so we are going to identify as politically Black, and we're going to organize together. Now, I don't know, I mean, it seemed to have been in fashion, and now it's not so much in fashion. But I don't know. I think that organizing works, and I know it was controversial, but I think that the armed struggle worked. Violence pushback worked. I know it's not a nice thing to hear, but it did. I think sanctions worked. And I think that reparation, if you think about reparation as trying, cash money does help, whether you set up scholarship systems or I don't know, advantages which, Black people haven't had before, whereas, it's been much easier for whites. There's that kind of reparation. Although some people say that you give that kind of reparation and then it's a case of, okay, we're square now, it's done, let's forget it. And maybe that's not so helpful. So maybe a reparation with an apology is more helpful. I can't hear you.
And if you're on mute.
I am still muted, and I've unmuted because I was making too much noise and hoping the phone doesn't ring. G, let me come to you and explore something with you there that Tess was talking about, and actually I can go into one of the questions that we had, which is linked in terms of, how do we start achieving some of this diversity in terms of representation, both within the structures of power, but even at a more local level in terms of just people's workplaces. So one of the questions that I had, which I will essentially paraphrase from someone, was that they were having a conversation in the workplace about kind of, white privilege and so on. And essentially what they noticed was that white colleagues were just being promoted a lot faster than everybody else, and their work was being recognized more than everybody else's. And so what can we do about that? And then I'm going to throw in my own question to you as well around that. Is this issue of essentially positive discrimination? Because I have so much dissonance on this myself. So I can understand why it's important in terms of ensuring that there is representation there. But then on a very personal level, I feel like, well, if there's people who applied for a certain job, I can't discriminate against one or the other. Or, how does that work? How do we start unpicking some of these really difficult issues, even in the workplace, let alone elsewhere?
You like easy questions, don't you?
Yeah, I do. That's what we're here for.
Oh, gosh. I mean, representation, yes, is something that I totally agree with. How we get there, I think, is very much open to debate. I'm not a fan of positive discrimination or affirmative action, because to me, what that says is we're not going to change until we have enough of you. So it's almost like the change is on the minority community. If enough of you come into our organization, we'll change. And I don't like that concept. I don't like that feeling. It's almost like, well, I'm not taking any ownership for my change. I'm going to have to be forced to change. How do we get there? It's a long process. I think that we're looking for short-term, quick, fast answers. And I think that that's what's always got us into trouble in the first place. We need to have a lot more dialogues. We need to have a lot more community conversations. We need to have a lot more healing. And I don't think we've healed enough to get to the place where we can start to have visible representation. Because I mean, any studies that you show, if we look at positive action or affirmative action, it will take 30 to 40 years before we get to the level where we think change will be effective. But then society's changed in 30 or 40 years. So that's only based on today's figures. So it's almost like it's a never achievable goal.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah. Can I just check something with you there?
Yeah.
So that process of exploration and conversation, that does that then mean that we shouldn't engage in kind of, challenging and being quite disruptive when that needs to happen? When essentially calling out racism for what it is and uniting against that shouldn't happen? Or that's not what I'm saying. Yeah,
I mean that's not what I'm saying. There are many ways. Diversity is like a hedgehog. Everybody has a point, right? There are so many different points in this dynamic. Not one point. There isn't one way to do this. And I think that's what everyone's looking for, that particular way to say, we have to do it this way. There is room for the violent confrontation. There is room for dialogue. There is room for the politics. There is room for everything. It's how that's done and how it's coordinated and how it's understood. But there isn't one way to say this is the right way or the wrong way. There are so many different ways. I remember going to see a speaker for an event, a woman called Louise Hay, right? And I went to see her talk at this event, and she said, one of the things she said which stuck with me, she goes, during this conference, there will be many speakers on the platform. Every single one of them will be saying exactly the same thing, but in different ways. Some of them you will look at and you will think, that's it. That's the best thing since sliced bread. Others you will look at and think, no, I'm sorry, I don't agree with you. But they're all saying the same thing. They're just saying it in different ways. And it's finding ways which resonate with you, which goes back to my point is we have to first of all think about where I'm coming from and which part of that struggle. Do I want to be a violent agitator? Do I want to be a political activist? Do I want to be somebody who quietly works my way up? There's space for all of those people.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense, actually. And I think it just touches on just what a complex issue this is, actually. And there is no one right answer. And anyone who claims to have that answer is deluded.
So can I just come back? Because I wanted to come back to that thing around identity as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because I have a phrase that I use, the complexity of identity. And I look at it and I say, we come from a place where sometimes we think identity is fixed. And it's not, it's fluid. Depending on who I am, who I'm with. I mean, okay, in this group, I'm a diversity practitioner. Right? If I'm with a group of Nigerians, my tribe becomes the important factor. If I'm with people from my tribe, the town I come from becomes an important factor. If I'm with people from my town, the street I live on becomes an important factor. If I'm with people on that street, the house I live in becomes an important factor. So depending on who I'm with and where I am will dictate which part of my identity is important in that moment in time. The problem we have, I think, with identity is that people want you to fit in one box. And none of us fit in one box. And I think that's the thing that we need to understand. We don't fit in one box. Yeah. And the more we try and put people in one box, the more complex and the more problems we end up getting.
Yeah, and there's a pushback to that, which almost needs to happen from all of us to say, well, stop. Like Safia says, that sometimes there's benefits to some of that pigeonholing. You know, like if you look at the census, we want to be able to say, well, actually, there's a high percentage of BME people, and we can tell through statistics that they're being disproportionately affected by X, Y, and Z, and that has its place, but not as this overarching construct that then just says you are this and nothing else, and you are this to the exclusion of all else. We've got 7 minutes, but I'm going to take a bit of a liberty, and we might just go 5 minutes over. So Dave's had an easy ride. So I've got a question for him. Prep yourself. Prep yourself, Dave. It's actually not from me. It's from somebody else. And then I don't think we've got any other questions. So what would be nice, and this was a request as well, is if we could go around and then everyone gives one thing that they think people could go away with, and someone could actually. So let me read the question properly. Before you finish, could the whole panel each give the viewers one thing they can do between now and the next session, there's an assumption there, to tackle racism and be an ally? So we'll come back to that in a minute. So I've got a question for Dave, which has been asked. And the comment and question is, this is a great discussion. Tessa mentioned about implementation. What can we do as local communities to bring about change when governments are not always welcoming of the change? Nice, easy one for you, Dave.
You know, I'm a vicar, right? Can you say it one more time? What can we do as communities?
What can we do as local communities to bring about change when governments are not always welcoming of the change? You're also a vicar, but you're in the local community, and you're Church of England. You guys have a lot of power.
Yeah, I mean, I think what it starts with for me is and we've been looking at this a lot for myself and others, is a sense of belonging. And there's a beautiful quote from Brené Brown, and she says, you can only belong, our sense of belonging can never be greater than our level of self-acceptance. So how can we as local communities teach people to want to love themselves? And I think once we can learn to do that, love others. And, you know, and I guess coming from, I am the Church of England, you know, that is, for me, one of the biggest things. You know, Jesus said, love God, love your neighbor as yourself. And a lot of the time, we don't love ourselves. How can we help people start to love who we are? And then out of that sense, be much more confident to belong and to be in community and be there with others. I think we come with so many broken issues in our own lives. I think there needs to be many more spaces where we can, I think talking is key in these situations and in local communities. I think we do need action as well, don't get me wrong. But on a local level, how can we start to build these stronger communities? You know, for us to be here, you know, I know last time we had Sarah, like a vicar, an imam, a Jewish, you know, it's great that we can actually talk and we can see commonality and we can start to care for one another and hear one another's stories. So how can we provide space for that to happen? It's harder to hate when you know somebody. And I think that builds stronger communities that then can start to affect government.
Wow, that's quite a good answer, Dave. Did really well there. I'm disappointed. I want you to sweat a bit more. Okay, so I think we've got to wrap up. We might go a few minutes over, and I think what I'll do is I'll give everyone just a couple of minutes. So if you could just watch your time for me, just to kind of as the request was there, give the viewers one thing that they can do, and then if you have any kind of, you know, summary thoughts, or all in 2 minutes. So I'll start with Tess, because she's in the top left of my screen, and I'll work my way around.
I think that we shouldn't be discouraged by government, and that there's a lot that can be done at a local level. I've certainly seen that in my experience. So I would say, don't sweat, don't panic about the massive picture. Just try to do what you can locally. Listen, call out, don't be complicit, and be willing to make a sacrifice if you want to make a change.
That's brilliant. G, over to you.
I think it's recognizing that we all have a voice. We all have a voice, and every voice is valid at the table, right? And not to allow people at that table to push you away from the table. I think we all have a voice. I mean, one of the things I like about this group is the diversity of this group. Everybody in this group has a voice, has experience, and has worth, and has dignity. And I think that's the thing, is that we have to recognize we have a voice. I like the Brené Brown thing that you said today, because I'm a big fan of Brené Brown as well, is, yeah, recognize the power of your own voice.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you. Mohammed?
For me, it's I sort of echo what Tess said earlier on, in terms of making sure that you, sorry, it was Dave that said earlier, which is to make yourself, sort of make yourself understand the people that are next to you, sort of familiarize yourself. You probably will end up hating less the more you understand someone. And that's why the Quran has a beautiful injunction in regards to this, where God tells us and says that I've created you from those two biological functions of Adam and Eve, right? But then it follows up with a beautiful scenario and says, but then I sort of subdivided you So first it came from this unity of two couples. And then I sort of subdivided you, وَجَعَلْنَاكُمْ شُعُوبًا, he says, right? And so we created you from a group of nations, and then group of sort of clans and lineages and tribes. So just something like G earlier on said, whereby you identify yourself first with your country, with your village, your street, and so on, right? So the identities are somewhat layered. But for what is the purpose of all of those labels and all those subdivision is so that you come to realize and come to know God, right? And you come to know and realize God, not through necessarily searching for God, but actually living and understanding with the ones that you've been created with, those people who came from a similar path as you. They will lead you to that path of God. So then therefore God concludes and says in the Arabic term, لَتَعَارَفُوا, and لَتَعَارَفُوا is a beautiful word here whereby God says that you know each other through your norms and your cultures and your understanding. So don't be alien to one another in another way. So yeah, and I love that scenario which they mentioned earlier on, and that's a beautiful message that I could take away from a meeting like this, because the diversity is what actually unites us.
Fantastic, thank you. Dave?
It's an interesting thing. I think it's something I've asked a few people. I've asked a few black friends of mine, and they said, "I don't want to educate you." And I think that's a good thing for us white people to hear as well. Educate yourself. There's no reason to be ignorant of racism, of things that have happened. There's good books out there. There's lots of good things been written down. So if, you know, use your voice, but educate yourself, get to know it, and don't expect everyone else to make that an easy road for you. But do some work yourself.
Yeah, Zoe.
I think it's really thinking all the time where the power play is and why that power is there. And on the day-to-day that can be exhausting, but we do live in a world that's all about divide and rule. So if we start to move away from that, away from a separatist society, I think even on the day-to-day, just saying, if you're okay, I'm okay. And we haven't even touched on COVID and our experience during COVID, but that early day of lockdown or days was when actually people became part of the human race again. They were drawn together around common purpose. My worry now is, as we're coming out, that the power structure will start to divide and conquer again. And that's already being played out in our media, in our politics. And I think we have to be aware of that. The knowledge, getting your knowledge from the right places is spot on. Get away from fake book, get away from media that's owned by the power elite, the white privileged, where actually they're brought into the politics of whatever country that they're doing deals with. You know, we have to become more broadly aware. And thinking about language is important. You know, I'm a big one about language, becoming more about the us, the we, together, everyone. You know, you start to say that on the day-to-day, you start to model behaviour, attitudes and norm. That would be my takeaway.
Yeah. Safia?
I think everything's been said so far. There's nothing to add on to that.
No, you have to come up with one thing at least.
So I think for me, one thing, if I look at my personal approach to things, is also always be accountable to yourself. Don't always say, what is that other person doing? What is, you know, what you know, the you know, positions of power, this other person, you know, is not smiling, they look a bit angry, they look a bit racist, whatever. What are you doing? What are you projecting out there? And I think as a community, we need to make sure, as individuals, as human beings, smiling to one another, opening discussions and making sure that you break those power, because like Zoe said, there's been a lot of progression done. People that you wouldn't have met otherwise, that you wouldn't have chatted with, or wouldn't have had a project that you would have worked together, because, you know, we have never been in the same environment before. And I think for me, one thing I always say to people as well recently is that, you know, there's people that say, this person has been in the country for so long, why don't they speak English? Well, why don't you go and talk to them in English and practice and communicate with them, because they've never had a chance. And I think it's about, what can I do to make our society, our community better, instead of saying, You know, what is the government going to do? What is, you know, this other person going to, what are they going to do to better? You know, why don't I support my fellow human being? And I think, you know, smiling is for me a charity from an Islamic perspective, so small, but it breaks barriers. You know, people that you don't know, just that simple smile of is an act of charity. And I think it's so important to make sure that we have an open face, that we smile, that we say hello, that we hold discussions as and when possible, because like our colleague said, is that we put people in boxes, we put ourselves in boxes, and we put other people in boxes, and we think we belong in this box, they belong in that box, and that's how it goes. But it isn't. It's for us to make yes, of course there's going to be differences and there's layers to our community, but we need to create our own community locally, and it should never be based on what you look like and about your diversity. It should be based on kindness and humanity and having the same aims and objectives.
Fantastic. Oh, well, what a way to finish those thoughts. And I'll just kind of add a couple of my own, if I may. I think that's absolutely right. I think that picking up on Zoe's point about how we were so together at the beginning of COVID, and it wasn't about race anymore, and it was about everyone coming out and clapping the carers, and, you know, it was about who we were and what we stood for. And that essentially sometimes, and this is where some of the media play comes into it, is we almost need an external enemy for togetherness for some strange reason, right? And so there are those who would give us an external enemy that is among ourselves, whereas actually we've got enough external enemies to deal with, you know, poverty and racism and hate and all these sorts of things. And maybe that's the narrative that we need to have now, is that we need to come together united against that external enemy and anyone who wants to stand for that and to continue to perpetuate that. So I've got two suggestions that are just kind of echoing some of what I've heard. Well, one is quite militant, because that's just my nature in a lot of ways, in terms of just standing against some of these things where we have our conversations and we come together. But whenever we see racism, that we call it out, and we call it out with a unified voice. And touching on what Tess was saying about sanctions and those sorts of things, you know, we know they make a difference. And so yes, as we're not government, we didn't have the ability to sanction people, but we do have the ability for us to boycott. And sometimes we just need to hit where it hurts. You know, some of these newspapers, we know they do it intentionally to divide. We know it. We all talk about it. And yet what we do is we end up sharing all of those articles on, you know, social media and all those sorts of things, giving them more statistics so that when they go to the advertisers, they just say, oh, well, look how many people we have, because if it bleeds, it leads. And so we should come together and kind of point out the racism, have a conversation and say, well, look, this wasn't on. Can you deal with it? And if they don't, then we have purchasing power. And we should not just boycott those institutions, but those who are affiliated with them. So the advertisers, you know, if you're going to advertise in a paper that's going to spread hate, then we're not going to buy from you. We're not going to shop with you, and we're going to call you out for what you are. And then I think that what we need to do is exactly what everyone said. You know, we just need to have more conversations, but to have conversations that are not necessarily constructed. They're not artificial. We just need to create the environment for us as human beings to come together more and to just spend time with each other and to smile at each other and to be benevolent with each other and to be caring and compassionate. And ultimately, when we have enough of a movement around that is kind of quote unquote touchy-feely like that, but has real power behind it, then I think that's when we're going to start seeing change. So I just have to thank all of you guys from the bottom of my heart for this conversation, and the one that we had last time. I've personally found it so enlightening, and it's given me a lot to personally reflect on. And I would say what I said at the very beginning of the first session last time. The whole point of this conversation was for us to give the opportunity for us to have a conversation, for other people to listen in, but to then hopefully inspire other people to go and have conversations in your own circles. And it doesn't matter what color the people are in those circles, just have the conversation. Don't let anyone stop your voice, make it a thing. Don't let it die a death, and let's just keep the momentum going. So thank you very much to everyone who's kind of watching this live and who's participated. Some people are leaving some really lovely comments about what a fantastic session it's been, and I have to agree. And thank you most definitely to our esteemed panel, to Tess, to G, Zoe, Dave, Mohammed, and Safia. Thank you guys so much. Hopefully this is all recorded and we can get it live, and you guys, everyone have a lovely evening, and let's catch up soon. Take care.
Take care. Bye.
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 Thank you, everyone.